Well, from a global perspective, one of the things that we're seeing in the world is many companies, like the S&P 500, for example, all have new requirements around ESG reporting, environmental, social, and governance reporting. Those reporting requirements are now ones that are almost becoming foundational from an investor standpoint. And if it's foundational from an investor, it also implies that your stock price may be affected by one way or the other by how well you're doing in any one of those areas. In the environmental area, we're seeing a lot of activity that's coming down from the management teams saying we need to have an environmental plan. What does that look like and how do we implement it? The question then is, when you go to implement it, it's not only the technical opportunities, because in many cases there are technical opportunities, but it's also the financing. How do we finance these? And at scale, there can be issues with regard to how much money am I putting into this energy or environmental mitigation, upgrade, energy intensity reduction, all those things that you want to see from the behind the meter standpoint. If I do it at scale, how much is that going to impact my financials as a corporation? And that leads us to sometimes a off-balance sheet or sometimes an off-credit type of discussion. Now what that means is that when we put these in place, the savings pay for the cost, and it is a variable pay contract, but the way it's structured meets the new accounting standards requirements. And those new accounting standards allow the corporation then to not count this against things like their debt ratios and coverage ratios, and overall it doesn't affect their Moody's S&P rating at some level. So these become very appealing at scale. When we talk about the technical details, many times the technical details are taken care of by people that are at the plant level or some corporate level, but generally below the C-suite, for example. But as soon as you get into finance questions, the finance questions become elevated to a level usually above that. Not that it's good or bad, it just is because the finance decisions are handled by other groups. The CFO, the Treasury group, and all of that. So there's an idea that at scale, again, you're doing larger projects across a wide variety of locations for a large customer. They want to have a common contract, for example. They want to have a common understanding of what the provisions of those contracts are in terms of the terms, the conditions, the covenants that they're signing up for, so that each individual plant doesn't sign up for their own version of what the idea would be. And then when it gets to corporate, they go, whoa, why do we sign up to all these different contracts that don't make any sense for us? So we see the stakeholders from a customer standpoint now starting to get up into the vice presidents and even CFOs, where they're becoming integral to this discussion. And by that I mean they're the ones that are helping drive this at scale idea, and they're driving the idea that I want a common set of contracts that meets these accounting standards rules so I get the outcomes I'm looking for, not just technical but also financial. And you really can't effectuate that at the plant level, generally speaking. The other key question that generally is asked, at least by me, is around something called delegation of authority. So if you think about any big company, Schneider Electric, for example, people at various levels can only sign off on so many dollars of commitment for the corporation, and that's true with any corporation. And if you're signing up to even though it might be called a service agreement, there may be a threshold level that the plant manager can't sign up for. Well, the ESA in and of itself has provisions around performance guarantees, and those performance guarantees take two forms. First, part of the performance guarantee is when we're implementing a project. So when we're implementing a project, you have to construct it, get it in on time, on budget, and everybody expects that to be done per the contract requirements. And there's a contemplation of having something called an acceptance at the end of that process. So when the customer accepts it, the customer is accepting the fact that you've put it in exactly the way it was supposed to be put in. So there's a risk there and performance guarantees around how you put that in and what the provisions are. And if you don't, there are some damages in many cases. The second part of the performance is after the acceptance, or what we call post-acceptance performance period. During that period, there is a series of requirements under the contract that may include, for example, energy savings. So what are the performance requirements under energy savings? How do we arrive at those? How do we measure those? How do we report those? And on what frequency to report those? And those dictate what the payments will be under the contract. There can also be things called key performance indicators, so KPIs. And the KPIs might be things like uptime, they might be things like response time to emergencies. So there's a series of these KPIs that might also be layered into the contract that then go back to the performance of, for example, Schneider Electric, that are part and parcel to this performance period guarantee. So in case of PPA, I'm buying power from some other source that in this case now is renewable. So I'm buying wind power or solar power or what have you. But now I've got to affect change in my buildings. And that behind the meter idea of affecting change in the buildings is where the ESA comes into play. So I'm going to put in new lighting, new HVAC and the like. So I'm affecting the demand side over here where the PPA is giving me a supply side solution. So the more you reduce the demand, the less you need of the supply. So they actually go hand in hand. So they're not in lieu of each other. Further, on an ESA, we've structured in many ways where I not only do the behind-the-meter lighting and HVAC and things of that nature, but I can also include solar, battery storage, to give a resiliency outcome as needed for the customer. So there are ways to work the ESAs that they can, and by the way, the ESAs can be energy savings agreements, energy services agreements, they could be energy as a service. These are all structured essentially the same way for the customer, depending on what outcomes they're looking for. And then I'm looking to reduce the amount of energy used in a building so you don't have to use as much supply. And then in that whole equation becomes this idea of resiliency and how resilient do I need to be at the location to supply power to critical loads for what time period. And that gets to the idea of having solar and battery storage together, which to combine give you resiliency. And there might be things like combined heat and power, for example, that then have a baseload power nature to them. So if there were a grid outage, that grid outage could be mitigated because now I have the base load of combined heat and power plus the battery storage on a spinning load with a black start capability that now I have this critical load covered irrespective of what the grid is doing.